Okay, picture this. It's New Year's Eve, 1984. A firefighter gets a call just after dark. Kitchen fire, possible grease fire. They pile into the truck and head to the address. By the time firefighters arrive, smoke is already pushing into the winter air. The flames move fast through the structure, climbing through old beams and dry wood that had spent decades absorbing kitchen heat, grease, and cigarette smoke. Seeing a burning building is always sad, but this one kind of hits different. The building is the Toll House Inn. This building had stood in some form for centuries. Travelers once stopped there on the old road between Boston and New Bedford to pay tolls, rest horses, and eat before continuing south. And now, firefighters are dragging hoses toward the birthplace of one of America's most recognizable desserts. Hey, hello, and welcome to another episode of True Crime Culinary, the show where we embrace the intersection of food history, psychology, and the little details you secretly wonder about. I'm your host, Leah, an enthusiastic food explorer. And here's the thing. I have got a sweet tooth. If I were on a marooned island and could only take 5 treats, a cookie would definitely be in the top 5. So it got me thinking, where do chocolate chip cookies even come from? And this history is super cool. I never knew any of these details and I cannot wait to share them with you like a chatty and excitable friend at happy hour. So grab a sweet and let's see how ye old cookie crumbles. Before chocolate chip cookies, cookies looked different. The word cookie comes from the Dutch word, and I'm going to slaughter this, koekje, meaning little cake. Bakers starting in the 1600s would place small amounts of batter into ovens first to test temperatures before baking larger cakes. Visual, very cute. Super pragmatic though, because ovens weren't like they are right now, not super controllable. I mean, you're moving like coals and stuff. So you kind of had to rely on other signals, such as a tiny cake to kind of assess whether the temperature was right, whether it was even, etc. So that means the cookie may have started as the culinary version of, well, let's see if this sets on fire. And those Dutch friends eventually brought the term to the East Coast, where it morphed into cookie. Around the 1800s, long before the Toll House cookie, there were also jumbles. Jumbles were early cookies dating back hundreds of years, often twisted into knots or rings, flavored heavily with spices like nutmeg, cinnamon, coriander, or caraway. Some were soft, some were hard enough to survive shipping and travel, and some looked closer to maybe pretzels than modern cookies. The name likely came from the idea of something kind of being tangled or mixed together, a jumble of ingredients twisted into a shape. Super adorbs. And if you look at older cookie recipes, they often relied on molasses, dried fruits, nuts, spice blends, maybe even rose water. That's because chocolate was expensive, because it relied on milk. So it was often a treat that only the very rich could afford. Sugar was also expensive. If you want to check out more about the history of sugarcane and or chocolate, check out episode 10 and 11. Back to biz. The texture of cookies mattered. Many early cookies were designed less around indulgence and more about preservation and portability, which makes sense when you remember that for most of history, dessert wasn't casual. Dessert was an event. And then industrial food production changed everything. Things became easier to make at scale, which meant more people could buy them. And then Ruth Wakefield entered the chat. She was a dietitian, food lecturer, and business owner. Not a random home baker who stumbled into history, which totes fair, but this girl had chops. In 1930, Ruth and her husband, Kenneth, bought the Toll House Inn in Whitman and transformed it into a successful roadside restaurant and lodge during the Great Depression. The name Toll House comes from the building's earlier role as a stop along an old toll road. And the purchase of this location mattered almost as much as Ruth's epic cooking and baking skills. Because roadside dining culture was expanding. Automobiles were changing travel. People wanted consistency. The Toll House became known for polished food, such as roast dinners, desserts, and reliable hospitality. And the Toll House Inn was especially popular for its desserts, especially their drop cookies. And if you're wondering what a drop cookie is, it's one where you make the batter and drop it onto a pan to bake, rather than using a press or a mold. So when we come to Ruth making the OG chocolate chip cookie, there's a couple stories that kind of talk about how it came into being, but one accepted story is that Ruth had traveled through or near Egypt before creating the recipe. Why is that relevant? Because she came up with the recipe on the way home. Now, coming home these days, long, sure, maybe double-digit hours if travel hates you, but lest we forget that traveling internationally in the late 1930s was an entirely different experience than today. So, returning to the United States would have likely involved some combination of steamships, rail lines, Mediterranean crossings, ocean liners across the Atlantic. So, we are not talking hours, we are talking weeks. Weeks, my friends. Which not only meant that she would have had, a few minutes to just kind of idle and think, but she would have also been in contact with a bunch of different foods, a bunch of different people, and probably just a chance to get creative. So sometime around 1938, Ruth created what she called the Toll House Chocolate Crunch Cookie. And the detail I love most is that she reportedly broke apart the chocolate using an ice pick. Yas, queen! Why the fantastically oversized tool? Because chocolate chips didn't exist yet. She chopped apart a semi-sweet chocolate Nestlé bar by hand so she could mix in the chunks into the dough. Some say she was surprised the pieces stayed in shape. Some say she was educated enough to know they wouldn't melt. I think, personally, she probably knew how to work a crowd and let people believe what they wanted, and thus we have multiple stories. Either way, can you imagine her in a retro kitchen with a cute apron, a bob, and an ice pick, just kind of looking at you like, you want to try this? I love that. So she started serving the cookies and people went absolutely batshit for them. It worked because this cookie landed at exactly the right intersection of flavor, chemistry, and texture. And what I didn't know before researching this episode is that brown sugar plays a huge role in why these cookies work. Brown sugar is brown because it has molasses in it. And molasses helps retain moisture because it's, hold on, hygroscopic. Not hydro, hygroscopic, meaning it attracts and holds water. The higher moisture changes the structure of the cookie dramatically. Brown sugar creates chewiness, softness, deeper caramel notes, while the white sugar behaves differently. It creates crispness, more spread, and lighter texture. So, with both of those sugars together, they helped create the now classic balance of a crisp edge but soft center. And then there was the chocolate. Semi-sweet chocolate mattered because it cut through sweetness with bitterness and depth. So the cookie wasn't all one note. It had contrast, butter, salt, caramelization, slight bitterness from the cocoa. And the recipe became so popular that customers began specifically asking for the chocolate Ruth used, which was a huge opportunity for Nestlé. Before this, baking chocolate usually came in bars and not little uniform pieces. Ruth reached out to Nestlé and they eventually partnered with Ruth's printed recipe directly on the chocolate packaging. And according to popular history, Ruth received a lifetime supply of chocolate in exchange. I mean, yes, queen! Snaps. What else happened? Nestle began manufacturing chocolate morsels specifically for baking. I used to work at a restaurant in the kitchen, and we'd get these like giant 50-pound bars of chocolate we'd have to shave down. And I'm not complaining, but I could see a world where if you had to chop that every single day, on one hand, your mental health would be potentially much better, but you might also just kind of reach a point where you're like, I just can't do this one more day. So it's kind of cool that the homemade recipe had become an industrial product category. And once that happened, the cookie could spread nationally. But then World War II accelerated everything because mail became one of the largest logistical systems on Earth. Governments quickly realized that morale mattered nearly as much as supplies. I did try to get a sense for does that mean that, while governments would be at war, they would be kind of like, yeah, but we'll let your mail pass. But it sounds like it just was within each country's government, it was a priority to make sure that mail got to the soldiers. And I say was, I hopefully it still is. But of course, they didn't have digital. Also, nobody likes a digital cookie. So at the time, sans digital, that meant people were sending letters, packages, and familiar foods to the people they cared about. And families mailed anything from photographs, cigarettes, knitted socks, candy, and baked goods. And chocolate chip cookies traveled surprisingly well because they were durable, dense, easy to stack, less fragile than cakes, which mattered because wartime mail still moved painfully slow, not much faster than Ruth getting home from Egypt. It would have to go probably by train, arrive at a military sorting center, cross oceans by ship, move through overseas depots. The T is silent. And eventually reach troops weeks later. Not to mention, ships carrying mail were occasionally sunk during war, which means somewhere beneath the Atlantic there are probably letters, photographs, and carefully packed cookies still resting together underwater. I gotta say, the mental image is both spooky and sad that people never got those cookies, but also a little part of me is wondering if there's like a giant squid, just kind of one little tentacle, just going through each and every one of those packages. Once soldiers got their packages, they were very likely to share what was inside. Thus, a Massachusetts, I don't know why, but that word is really hard to say for me today, cookie recipe suddenly ended up in Texas, California, Kansas, and soldiers began writing home asking for those Toll House cookies. Regional foods spread nationally because millions of people were suddenly living beside strangers from every corner of the country, and after the war, people carried those tastes home with them. So by post-war years, the chocolate chip cookie had moved beyond recipe status. It was more of an emotional shorthand of comfort, food, care, childhood, kind of like baking with your grams. And companies realized they could package that feeling. So first came bagged chocolate morsels, but then refrigerated dough, frozen dough, break and bake tubes, malled cookie chains, cookie dough ice cream. Eventually, edible cookie dough itself became a commercial product, of which I was a frequent flyer, because as a teen, I remember eating a shit ton of cookie dough and rarely eating a cooked or baked cookie. Overall, I love that we hit the point that like baking is optional. I am, however, very happy to report I did not get the salmonellas, and that is due to the rise of refrigerated cookie dough that also relied heavily on improvements in ye olde refrigeration, preservatives, and grocery distribution systems. So companies could sell the parts, the semi-combined version, or the whole thing to people to cater to them at whatever stage they were. But what happened to the Toll House Inn? Well, I think there were about 200 people there that night. No one was injured, but unfortunately they never rebuilt it. I think there's a sign there now that kind of says like, this was the Toll House Inn, but sadly they didn't rebuild it. Ruth passed away, I want to say in 1977. So kind of like silver lining, she didn't see the thing get burnt down. By that point, she had already sold the Toll House Inn, but again, she was a huge force in baking. She made a ton of cookbooks. Her literal recipe was on the side of the product for many a year. She inspired a whole product category on food with the chocolate morsels. And generally, she just seemed like a badass. Because she literally, I think, reached out to Nestlé and was like, yo, I have this epic recipe. You should probably figure out how to get me on the side of this box. So that's pretty cool. And especially in the 1930s and 40s when like, hello, feminine rights, not at their peak. So I just think it's like such an epic story to hear about this woman who just kicked ass. So cool. So next time you eat a chocolate chip cookie, think about the epic history that went into that delicious semi-crumbly friend. That's it for this week's True Crime Culinary. See you next week. Until next time, stay curious and be careful what's in your cup. Check out our show notes for sources, hit that subscribe button, rate and review the podcast anywhere you listen.